Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. Thank you for letting me join you for the 5th CSS conference. My name is Brian Birtles. I'm from Mozilla, and I'm sorry, I don't speak any Chinese at all. But thank you. Thankfully, Fu Chao has translated some of the slides. Xiao Qian is going to write some transcript on the WeChat. So hopefully you can understand something. I will try to speak clearly as well. So thank you. Today I want to speak about the animation, which is my favorite topic. And I want to share 10 things that I wish more people knew about animation. But first of all, please let me introduce myself. I have no idea what you both just said, so forgive me if I'm repeating what he said. I was born in Australia, but I now live in Tokyo. And for nearly 15 years, I've been working for Mozilla and mostly working on Firefox and Firefox's animation features. I was a web developer before that, but I wanted to make the web better, so I started to contribute to Firefox. I work on CSS animations and transitions and SVG and web animations. As part of that, I'm involved in the W3C working groups for previously SVG and now CSS as well, where I edit CSS animations and transitions and web animations. Apart from work, I enjoy swimming and surfing and everything with the water. And for my favorite food, although I love Chinese food, I had a really good lunch today. My favorite food is meat pies. I'm not sure if you know meat pies, but I love meat pies. When I was in university, I would sometimes spend a whole day just making meat pies. But recently, I don't have so much time to make meat pies. I spend more time making apps. And so today, I thought for talking about animations, I'd use the example of an app. I thought, what could be a good app? So I would like to propose the first social networking service for people who like meat pies. This is my app pitch. It's got an Instagram-like feed of pictures of meat pies. It has pie charts, of course, and it has a map for finding pie shops as well. So this is my proposal. If anyone likes it, let's talk about it afterwards. But I want to use this as an example for talking about how to add animations to web pages, but especially to apps. How would you add animations to this kind of app? I've been working on animations for nearly 15 years, and there's a lot I don't know, but there's some common problems I have seen which I wish more people understood. So today I want to share 10 of the common problems that people face with animations, or things I wish more people knew. There's 10 points, and they cover CSS transitions, CSS animations, which maybe you know, also web animations, which I think less people know, and performance and accessibility as well. There's 10 points. Some of them are very long, some are very short. They start very long and they get shorter and shorter. But the first one is the longest one. It's the hardest one, but it's the most important one. So let's get started. So first of all, CSS transitions. I think many of you know CSS transitions. In CSS, often style changes. So when we hover this, style changes. If we add a transition, then we can make that change smooth. So it's very easy to add transitions to a CSS page. But you don't normally animate meat pies, I think. Normally you probably animate something like a button, something like this. It's just very, very subtle. You almost can't see that it's animated. But if you remove the transition, then it just feels a little bit less polished, a little bit less professional. So in an application, we might use it for something like popping up a pop-up. So transitions are very, very easy, but there's a common problem that nearly everyone faces when they use transitions. And this is the problem. Maybe some of you can see the problem already. Often when you're making an app, you are making new elements using JavaScript, and then you want to transition them. So you want to take this panel and then transition it in to make it grow. But if we try to use that, there's no transition. What's wrong? Well, we have to look at how transitions work. So as you probably know, the browser updates the screen maybe 60 times every second. And each time it updates, that's called an animation frame. And as part of each frame, there are several steps the browser runs. The first one is it updates the style. So it works out for every element, what is its color, what's its opacity, and so on. And then it uses that information to calculate the layout. Often CSS will define the width, but the browser has to calculate the height. And then after that, it produces the pixels that go on the screen. And the way that transitions work is they look for changes in that style when it updates the style. So in this example, the opacity has changed from 0 to 1, and because we said there's a transition on opacity, we get a transition. But in our example, which didn't work before, we have some JavaScript which runs after updating, after painting, but it runs all the way to the end before style gets updated. And so when we finally update style in the next frame, the browser doesn't see the old style because it's a new element. It never had any previous transform. So there can't be any transition. There's nowhere to transition from. So how can we fix it? Well, most people would think we just need to wait another frame. Just use request animation frame and then we'll get a transition, surely. And then they try it and it doesn't work. What is wrong with Firefox? What is wrong with CSS? And you get really frustrated with transitions. They're supposed to be simple, but they just don't work. Why doesn't it work? Well, if you try it in Chrome, it won't work as well. It might work in Safari. That's a bug in Safari. But you can see why transitions can be very frustrating. But let's look at what happens. In this example, we run some JavaScript where we update the transform, and then we call request animation frame. But request animation frame is special. It runs at the start of the frame, before we update the style. Most JavaScript runs at the end of the frame. All of your event handlers for clicks and set timeout, everything runs at the end of the frame. But request animation frame runs at the start. And so do a couple of other special cases like resize events, full screen events, and animation events. So when we go to run style, we still have only seen the last change when we set it to scale 1. So we still can't make a transition. So how can we fix it? Well, the answer that a lot of people come to is, well, we do request animation frame twice. And let's see if that works. It does! Yes! So because what happens in this case is in the first bit of script, we set the transform to 0. The next request animation frame, we do nothing. But then style runs and it picks up that scale 0. Then in the next request animation frame, we set it to 1. Style runs again. And so we can have a transition. So that's quite annoying, I think. And it means transition takes a long time to start as well. So there must be a better way of doing this. Well, there are a few, and one of them is just to do this. if we call getComputedStyle and then read one of the properties, then we force the browser to update style right now. So if we do that, we'll see it works. So that's a little bit easier. If we look at what happens, then when we're running script, we actually force style to happen then. Sometimes you'll see people use scroll left or client height or something. That has the same effect, but they make the browser do layout as well, which is unnecessary. So you can see in this example, we get the change in style. So the transition runs. So the most important thing to know about transitions, if they're not happening, it's probably because the browser hasn't seen a change in style. And that happens particularly when you're using a framework like React or Vue, which is creating elements, and then you're trying to transition them, but also when you use display none, because when elements are display none, they have no style. So when they leave being display none, they still have no previous style to transition from. The other thing which a lot of people get confused by is that calling getComputedStyle doesn't update styles. You have to call it and then read one of the properties on it, like transform or something. Alternatively, you could just not use transitions in this case, and that might be a better choice. We'll talk about how to use CSS animations soon, but first I want to say one more thing about transitions. In our example, we transitioned the window in, but when we press the button again, I made it just remove it. But we'd like it to transition out as well. So how can we do that? Well, we can use something like this. We can start another transition and then wait for the transition to end and then remove the element. And that should work. Great. The problem with this is what happens if while that second transition is running, something like it becomes display none, or the element gets recreated, or the transition property changes. If any of these things happen, the transition will get cancelled, and the transition end event will never fire, and the app will break. In Mozilla, we worked on Firefox OS, and there were a lot of web apps on Firefox OS, and they would often have bugs where the app would stop working, and many of the bugs were because they were waiting for transition end events that never happened. It's because of one of these reasons. So this is an example. I've changed this code so that the second transition is slower, and I've made it so that if I press the button twice during that transition, the second time will cancel it. Let's see what happens. So I've cancelled the transition, that's okay. Now it doesn't respond, it's completely broken. If I try to look for that panel in the dev tools, you see the panel's still there, it didn't get removed. So this is a bug. How can we fix this bug? Well, one way is you can use set timeout. So if you have a 300 millisecond transition, set a timeout for 400 milliseconds. If you still haven't got the event, then clean up. Another approach is there's a new transition event, transition cancel, that we specified and is coming in Chrome and Safari soon, which lets you know when the transition has been cancelled, and also transition run, which will tell you if a transition has been created in the first place, because if it's not created, there's not going to be a transition end. So using that in this example, we cancel it, but it still works. So the second thing I wish more people knew about animations is that transitions can be cancelled. So if you're waiting for transition end events in your app, you might have a bug if you haven't handled that. So that's transitions. Next is CSS animations. CSS animations are a little bit different. So in CSS animations, we would set up a keyframes rule and then just apply it to the element. like so. And there's many different options, like we can make it go backwards and forwards, or we could add opacity in or something else. I'm not going to explain all of the features of CSS animations, but returning to the pop-up example, previously we had to use request animation frame and get computed style to make this transition run, but we could also have just used CSS animations and just specify the animation and apply it like this, and that works as well. In fact, we don't even need the 2 keyframe. We can just leave that off and it will animate to the current style. So CSS animations are great, but there's a problem which nearly everyone encounters with CSS animations. And it's to do with easing. We can change the easing of the animation. So if I say linear, it's a more even rate of change. And this is a shorthand property, so we could just say animation timing function linear. That would produce the same effect. But what not so many people know is that you can also put animation timing function on keyframes. And you can see that the steps timing function only applies between the first 2 keyframes. And so this is very convenient, but also very confusing. I'll show you why. One day I was sent this video by a Firefox OS engineer. And they said, what's wrong with this animation? It seems to get slower in the middle and then fast at the end. Firefox is broken. Now I'll show you it in slow motion so you can see. In the middle it gets slow and then it gets fast again. What's wrong? And so I spent quite a while debugging this. And then I looked at the animation itself. And this is the animation. And you can see it gets slower in the middle. What's wrong? Firefox is broken again. Well, if you were to look at this in the DevTools, in Animation Inspector, you would see something like this. You can see the graph here actually kind of stops in the middle. And on the bottom as well, these graphs kind of stop in the middle. Why is it doing that? Well, that's because of the way animation timing function works. Even if you put it on the element, it always applies between the keyframes. So it doesn't matter that I'm putting it on the element here, it's going to run in between each of the keyframes. So the way to fix this bug is just to get rid of that middle keyframe. We don't need it. And then you'll see it's running smoothly. So the only thing which I want more people to know about CSS animations is that animation timing function always applies between the keyframes. So what can you do if you want it to apply across the whole animation? Well, sometimes you can change the keyframes like I did here, but the other option is to use web animations. Maybe not so many people know of web animations. It's basically a JavaScript API in the browser for doing the same sorts of animations as CSS animations and transitions. So this is the same animation as the one I showed you a moment ago, but just using JavaScript instead. People might wonder, why do we need it? The main reason is performance. There are lots of animation libraries, but because this is a browser API, it can allow the browser to run the animation on another process or another thread so that it's less likely to be interrupted. But this is CSS conference, so maybe you think we should just use CSS. Well, the idea is that this is something you can use together with CSS. And in future, we will ship a part of the API that lets you use this JavaScript API to modify and control and inspect CSS animations. That's implemented in Firefox and Chrome and in Tech Preview for Safari. So we're just waiting for Safari to release that. It's being used a little bit, about 4% of pages, mostly by Polymer and Angular users, I think, and it's getting a bit of interest. So it still needs feature detection, and I'll return to that in a moment. But I think you can use it today. I don't think you need to wait, depending on your application. So that's the fourth thing, is just give web animations a try. But if you do, you might discover there's some little differences. Some of the names are a little bit different. JavaScript programmers don't like long names very much, so we made some of the names a bit shorter. But the biggest difference is the way easing works. The default easing in CSS transitions and animations is ease, but in web animations it's linear. And there's a reason for that. I mentioned before how CSS animations always does easing between keyframes. But in web animations you can do either between keyframes, as in the top, or over the whole animation, as in the bottom. And you can do both at the same time if you like. That's why it's linear, because you need to decide where you want the easing to run. If you look at those two examples in DevTools, you can see the different shape in the graph. So you can see the first one has that stop in the middle, but the second one, it's smooth. So please give web animations a try, but just remember there are some small differences with CSS animations. Performance. I don't know about you, but I find performance kind of boring. It feels like it's just a lot of rules, and someone's always telling you you're doing it wrong. And feels like it should just be fast. Why do I have to work so hard to make it fast? So I'm going to keep this really, really simple. Just 3 things to keep in mind that will hopefully make your animation smoother. The first one you've probably heard before. When possible, try to animate only transform and opacity. Those 2 properties all browsers can animate efficiently. There are some other properties that some browsers can do efficiently, but every browser can do transform and opacity efficiently. So I think the example before of shape, image, threshold, it's maybe not the most performant approach. But if you just have transform and opacity, then that seems very limiting, right? You can't do a lot with just 2 properties. But actually you can do quite a lot. You can move things, you can make them grow, you can make them spin, you can do 3D transforms, you can do fade effects, you can put them all together. But you can also do some very interesting things like a color fade, or a shadow effect, or a kind of split up effect. Because you can just layer these elements on top of each other. So if we look at the color effect, we just have a pink pie which we're just changing the opacity on. The actual brown pie doesn't change at all. Or for the shadow effect, we just have 2 elements. One is the shadow and one is the pie, and we transform them both. So there's no other properties, just opacity and transform. And same for the split one as well, it's just a transform effect. So you can do a lot. In my app, I'm using it for the little backgrounds on the bottom. That looks like it's animating the background, but it's actually just another element where we animate the transform and opacity. And actually you've seen that before if you've used Gmail. I'm not sure if it's popular here or not, but they use the same effect for the background of the labels. It's just a pseudo element with opacity and transform transitions on it. A few years ago I was involved in a project to recreate a Japanese fairy tale using CSS animations and web animations, and except for the text, everything else is just transform and opacity. So you can actually do quite a lot with just transform and opacity if you're a little bit creative about how you use it. So maybe some of you know this story, I'm not sure. But yeah, it was a lot of fun. Okay, so point 6 is just to animate transform and opacity if at all possible. But sometimes you want to know, am I doing it right? Is the performance good or not? Well, you can look in the dev tools and actually check that. In this example on the left, we're animating the background color and the opacity. And next to the opacity is a little lightning mark. And this means that this is being optimized. It's actually able to run on a separate thread, a separate process. So that tells us we're doing it right. The background color is not optimized, but you don't notice it as much for colors. On the other hand, if we look at the animation on the right, it's animating transform, but it says it can't optimize this because we're animating width and height at the same time, and it tries to synchronize width and height animations with transform ones, otherwise it would look funny. So I can show you a slightly enlarged version. So this is a feature in Firefox Animation Inspector, and I had heard that the Chrome team were adding the same thing to Chrome, but I couldn't find it recently, so maybe they haven't finished it yet. But for the time being, I wish more people knew about this because I think it's quite convenient. Last point for performance. Some people here, I think, use things like React and Vue and other frameworks. And if you're making a single page app, a lot of these have a feature that lets you only produce the DOM elements for the page you're currently looking at. So in this example, this uses React router, I don't know how you say it. And depending on what page you're looking at, it will only produce the elements for the photos or the polls page. And that's fine, that works really well. But then people want to animate these changes. And so they use something like CSS transition group or something. And again, that works. You can see this is using it here. It's a little bit glitchy, but it works. But if you look at what's happening in the DOM, let's see. Sorry, I have the font too big. Screens. So under screens here, we have the photo slide showing, and when we switch to the other one, we have just the Finder elements. All the other elements are gone from the DOM. Think about what the browser has to do when you click one of those buttons. It has to then create all the DOM elements for the next page. And then it needs to resolve the style on them. It needs to do the layout. It needs to paint these new elements. And then finally it can start the animation. It looked alright on my screen, but it's a fast computer and it's a very simple app. When you have a complicated app and a slow phone, then you'll find that there's a delay when you press the button. You press the button and then you're waiting for the screen to show. Even on this fast computer, it was taking 100 milliseconds just to finish responding. What if instead of doing that, we just put all the elements in the DOM always? That would be a lot faster because then the browser can skip most of the work. All it needs to do is just animate the thing. So we can see that. It seems to work fine. But you can't really tell just looking at that on this computer. But if we looked at it in the profiler, then even on this computer, you can see there's a much faster response time. So in an ideal world, you would just have everything always in the DOM, then it's very fast to animate. But maybe if your application is very complicated, then it will get slower again, because there's so many things in the DOM. But one alternative is like in this app, we can just have a placeholder in the DOM, something we can animate quickly and then update. So we don't need to have everything in the DOM already, just something we can animate right away. That will make the app feel much more responsive. As soon as you press the button, it does something. So the point 8 is, if possible, try to keep something in the DOM ready to animate straight away. Finally, accessibility. In January, my sister came to Tokyo and we went to a kind of light experience show where you go into a very dark room with lots of coloured lights that are flashing everywhere. And it was really interesting, but after about 30 minutes, we began to feel really sick. We both got headaches and we had to leave. It was just so intense. And some people feel like that when they use web pages that have a lot of animation, especially if the animation is the whole page, like a parallax effect, or if it's something that moves from one side of the screen to the other quickly. Some people actually feel unwell when they see that. And that's why recently in operating systems there are controls to reduce the amount of motion. And this is not just in Windows and Mac, this is also in iOS and Android and Linux as well. And the good news is you can now actually check that in CSS. There's a media query, prefers reduced motion, for checking this. It's been in Safari and Firefox for a while, and it will be in Chrome next month. So you can check if the user doesn't like animations, you can turn off especially the bigger animations. The small hover effects are probably okay. And if you're using JavaScript as well, you can check there as well using the media query API. So I mentioned that if you're using web animations, you should probably feature detect before you use it. And that's a great point to also check if the user wants animations too. And so you have to have your animated version and your non-animated version. So point 9, you can check if the user wants animation or not, and you probably should, especially if you have big animations. So 10 things about animations. Transitions, if they're not happening, check that the browser sees the change. Remember that they can be cancelled. Maybe you actually should use CSS animations, but remember that easing can be a little bit tricky because it only applies between the keyframes. You can use web animations though if you want to ease the whole effect, but remember it has some little differences. The performance, try to animate transform and opacity, and I can't read the rest, but I'm sure you can. And accessibility, you should check if your users want animations or not. I said there would be 10 points, but there's only 9. When I was preparing these slides, I thought, yeah, 9's probably enough. I don't want to make this sound too difficult. There is a lot of science behind animations. Animations can make it easier for people to understand your interface and focus on the task. But I think equally as important, animations can just be fun as well. If you make sure they're not annoying, if you make sure they're smooth, and if you respect the user's choices to not have animations, then they can be a lot of fun for your users. And if your users are happy, they're going to give you better ratings, more referrals, be more loyal customers, and it will just be a more successful experience. So finally, just remember to have fun as well. So thank you so much for all your attention, and thank you for my help with scribing.